Readings. In the spring of 1915, all the fields of Morelos were under cultivation, mostly with corn and food crops. Meanwhile, food was short and hunger loomed in Mexico City. Carranza, who had won the presidency, also ordered a land reform, but his henchmen speedily cornered all its benefits. In 1916, Morelos' capital, Cuernavaca, and the Zapatista district were threatened by powerful forces. Crops now coming to fruition, minerals, hides, and machines were attractive booty for the advancing officers, who set fires as they came, and proclaimed a work of reconstruction in progress. Quote, a stratagem and a betrayal ended Zapata's life in 1919. 1,000 men lying in ambush fired into his body. He died at the same age as Che Guevara. The legend of the Sorrel House, galloping alone southward through the mountains, survived him. By not only the legend, the resolve of all Morelos to quote, complete the reformer's work, avenge the martyr's blood, and follow the hero's example, end quote, found echo throughout the country. Time passed, and under the presidency of Lázaro Cárdenas, 1934 to 1940, the Zapatista tradition regained life and vigor with the nationwide implementation of agrarian reform. Mainly during this administration, 67 million hectares owned by foreign or Mexican corporations were expropriated, and in addition to the land, peasants received credits, education, and the means to organize their work. The economy and population had begun their accelerating rise. Agricultural production multiplied while the whole country underwent modernization and industrialization. Cities expanded, and the consumer market grew in breadth and depth. But Mexican nationalism did not lead to socialism, and consequently, like other countries that failed to take the decisive step, Mexico did not fully achieve its goals of economic independence and social justice. The million dead in the Revolutionary War years had paid blood tribute, quote, to Huitzilopochtli, more cruel and insatiable than the one our ancestors worshipped. The capitalist development of Mexico under conditions imposed by subordination to imperialism. The fading of the bright banners has been studied by a variety of scholars. Edmundo Flores writes in an official publication that, quote, at the present time, 60% of Mexico's total population has incomes below $120 a year and goes hungry, end quote. 8 million Mexicans consume almost nothing but beans, corn, tortillas, and chilies. The Tlatelolco massacre of some 500 students in 1968 is not the only evidence of the system's deep contradictions. Using official figures, Alonso Aguilar concludes that Mexico has some 2 million landless peasants, 3 million children not attending school, around 11 million illiterates, and 5 million who have no shoes. Collectively owned Ejido land is continually being partitioned, and along with the multiplication of minifundios, which themselves become steadily more fragmented, a new type of latifundio system and a new agrarian bourgeois engaged in large-scale commercial farming have made their appearance. Local landlords and entrepreneurs who have achieved a dominant position by trampling on the letter and spirit of the law are in turn dominated. A recent book classifies them within the words, quote, and co, end quote, attached to Anderson Clayton. In the same book, Lázaro Cárdenas' son writes that, quote, the camouflage latifundios have been established, when possible, on the best and most productive lands, end quote. Novelist Carlos Fuentes has reconstructed, in reverse chronological order, the life of a captain in Carranza's army who in war and then in peace uses gun and cunning to make his way to the top. A man of humble origin, Arternio Cruz sheds the idealism and heroism of his youth as the years pass. He helps himself to land, funds, multiplies businesses, gets a seat in the Congress, and climbs the shining steps to the peaks of society, accumulating wealth, power, prestige by wheeling and dealing, bribery, speculation, audacity, and the bloody repression of the Indians. His pilgrim's progress resembles that of the potently impotent party of the Mexican Revolution, which virtually monopolizes the country's political life in our time. Both have fallen upward. Latin American agriculture and livestock production per capita is lower today than on the eve of World War II. This book was written in the 1970s. During the 30 years since then, world production of food has grown in the same proportion as it has fallen in Latin America. The structure of backwardness in our countryside also functions as a structure of waste of labor, of available land, of capital, of the product, and above all of the fleeting opportunities for development that history has offered. In almost all Latin American countries, the latifundio and its poor relation, the minifundio, are the bottlenecks choking the growth of agriculture and the development of the whole economy. The private property system molds the production system. 1.5% of the agricultural landlords own half of all the cultivatable land. Every year, Latin America spends more than $500 million on importing foods that its own broad and fertile lands could produce without difficulty. Hardly 5% of the total area is under cultivation, the lowest proportion, and consequently the greatest waste on earth. Furthermore, yields from the small acreage that is cultivated are very low. In many areas, there are more pointed stick plows than tractors. The use of modern techniques, not only the mechanization of tasks, but the aid and stimulation of the soil with fertilizers, herbicides, seeds, pesticides, and artificial irrigation is the exception rather than the rule. In a manner sometimes recalling the Sun King, Louis the 14th, the latifundio forms a constellation of power which, in Maza Zavla's apt phrase, multiplies mouths but not bread. Instead of absorbing labor, the latifundio expels it. In 40 years, the proportion of rural workers in Latin America has fallen from 63% to 40%. There are plenty of technocrats mechanically applying ready-made formulas to tell us that this is a sign of progress, massive transfer of the peasant population, accelerated urbanization. The unemployed, continually vomited by the system, do indeed pour into the cities and extend its suburbs, but the factories, which also create unemployment as they modernize, provide no refuge for this surplus and non-specialized labor force. The scanty technical advances in the countryside sharpen the problem. Landlords increase their profits by adopting more modern ways to exploit their properties. As more hands become idle, the gap separating rich and poor only widens. For example, the introduction of motorized equipment eliminates more rural jobs than it creates. Malnutrition is the normal lot of Latin Americans who produce the food in dawn-to-dusk workdays. They receive paupers' wages while the income produced by the countryside is spent in the cities or sent abroad. Technical improvement that increases the soil's meager yields while leaving the property system intact is certainly no blessing to the peasants. Despite its contribution to general progress, there is no rise in their wages, nor any participation in the crop. The countryside radiates poverty to the many and wealth to the few. Private airplanes soar over forlorn deserts. Sterile luxury is spawned in fashionable resorts, and Europe teems with banknote-stuffed Latin American tourists who neglect to cultivate their lands, but not their souls. Paul Bayrock attributes the principal weakness of the Third World's economy to the fact that its median agricultural productivity is only half what today's developed countries achieved on the eve of the Industrial Revolution. In fact, for example, to expand harmoniously, a much greater increase in the production of food and agricultural raw materials is needed. Food because the cities keep growing and eating more, raw materials for the factories and for export, so that agricultural imports can be cut and foreign sales, which provide currency needed for development, increased. Furthermore, domestic consumption, which must expand if infant industries are to thrive, is enfeebled by the latifundio-minifundio system. Hunger wages in the countryside and the ever-growing reserve army of unemployed encourage this weakness. The immigrants from the rural areas who come to beat on city doors keep pushing down the overall level of the workers' wages. Ever since the Alliance for Progress trumpeted the need for agrarian reform to the four winds, the oligarchy and technocracy have tirelessly elaborated projects. Dozens of projects, fat ones, thin ones, broad and narrow ones, gather dust on the shelves of every Latin American parliament. No curse is attached anymore to the theme of agrarian reform. Politicians have learned that the best way not to have it is to keep invoking it. The simultaneous process of concentration and atomization of the land continue olympically in most of the countries. Nevertheless, exceptions are beginning to break through, for the countryside is not merely a seedbed of poverty, it is also a seedbed of rebellion, and acute social tensions often lie concealed behind the apparent resignation of the masses. Brazil's northeast, for example, impresses one at first as a kingdom of fatalism whose inhabitants consent to die of hunger as passively as they accept nightfall at the end of each day. Yet it is not so long, after all, since that mystical explosion when the Northeasterners fought beside their way-out messiahs, rising cross and gun against armies to bring the kingdom of heaven to this world, nor since the cangaceiros created waves of violence, fanatics and bandolieros seeking utopia and vengeance made a bed for the river of desperate peasant protest, even though it was still blind. The peasant leagues later recovered and deepened these fighting traditions. The military dictatorship that seized power in Brazil in 1964 was prompt to announce its agrarian reform. Paulo Schilling has drawn our attention to the uniqueness of the Instituto Brasileiro de Reforma Agraria. Instead of distributing land to the peasants, it proceeded to expel them and to restore to the latifundios the acreage that had been spontaneously invaded and expropriated under previous governments. 1966 and 7, before press censorship was applied with greater rigor, the dailies used to report the spoliations, conflagrations, and persecutions with which the military police carried out the hard-working institute's orders. In 1964, Ecuador proclaimed another agrarian reform that deserves recognition. The government distributed unproductive land only, while facilitating the concentration of better land in the grip of the big landlords. Half of the land distributed by Venezuela's agrarian reform, beginning in 1960, was public property. Big commercial plantations were untouched, and such generous indemnities were paid to expropriated latifundistas that they brought new land in other areas with the profits. 1968, a couple years before his fall, Argentine dictator Juan Carlos Onganía tried to apply a new tax system of rural property. The idea was to tax unproductive bare plains more heavily than productive land. The cattle oligarchy protested to high heaven and mobilized their own forces on the general staff, and Onganía had to forget his heretical idea. Like Uruguay, Argentina's natural fertile lands and benign climate have brought it relative prosperity in Latin America, but erosion does its remorseless work on the vast abandoned plains, which are neither farmed nor used for pasture, and the same occurs on a large part of the millions of hectares used for cattle raising. This extensive method, again as in Uruguay, but to a smaller extent, was at the bottom of the crisis that shook the Argentine economy in the 1960s. Argentine latifundists show no interest in technical innovation. Productivity is low because it suits them. The law of profit prevails over all others. Extending estates by buying new acreage is more remunerative, profitable, and less risky than applying modern intensive techniques. In 1931, the Sociedad Rural defended the horse against the tractor. Cattle farmers working with horses on an agricultural task is protecting your own and the country's interests, end quote. 20 years later, it insisted, quote, "It is easier, as a well-known military man had said, to put grass in a horse's stomach than gas in the tank of a heavy truck," end quote. According to ECLA calculations, in proportion to arable acreage, Argentina has 16 times fewer tractors than France and 19 times fewer than Britain. Also, in proportion, the country consumes 140 times less fertilizer than West Germany. Yields of wheat, corn, and cotton are much lower in Argentina than in developed countries. Juan Domingo Perón had defied the interest of Argentina's landowning oligarchy by imposing the statute of the peon and compliance with a rural minimum wage. In 1944, the Sociedad Rural declared, "In fixing wages, it is essential to determine the standard of living of the ordinary peon. His material needs are sometimes so limited that the use to which any surplus will be put is of little social interest." End quote. The Sociedad Rural continues to refer to peons as if they were animals, and its reflections on the workers' limited need to consume provide an unintentional key to the limitations of Argentine industrial development. The internal market neither expands nor deepens sufficiently. Perón's economic development policy never broke the structure of agricultural underdevelopment. In his speech at the Teatro Colón in June 1952, Perón denied any intention of agrarian reform, and the Sociedad Rural commented officially it was a masterly dissertation. In Bolivia, thanks to the agrarian reform of 1952, nutrition visibly improved over large areas of the Altiplano, so much so that increases in height were noted among the peasants. Yet the Bolivian population as a whole still consumes barely 60% of the protein and 20% of the calcium necessary for a minimum diet. Rural consumption is even more deficient than these average figures reveal. While agrarian reform can certainly not be called a failure, the division of Altiplano land has not been enough to prevent Bolivia from spending one-fifth of its foreign currency on imported food. The agrarian reform introduced in 1969 by the military government in Peru looked from the outset like a serious experiment. As for the Eduardo Frei administration's expropriation of some Chilean latifundios, it must at least be credited with opening a channel for the radical agrarian reform which the new president, Salvador Allende, is announcing as I write these pages. In Latin America, private appropriation of lands always came before its useful cultivation. The more backward aspects of the present property system are not the offspring of crises, but emerged in periods of great prosperity. Inversely, periods of economic depression have tempered the veracity of the latifundistas in acquiring new acreage. In Brazil, for example, the decline of sugar and the virtual disappearance of gold and diamonds made possible between 1820 and 1850 legislation providing that anyone who occupied land and made it produce acquired title to it. The rise of coffee as a new king product produced the 1850 law of lands, cooked to the taste of oligarch politicians and military men, and denying ownership of land to those who worked it when the great spaces of the interior to the south and the west were being opened up. This law was subsequently reinforced and ratified by abundant legislation that decreed purchase as the only form of access to land and created a civil registration system that would make it nearly impossible for a poor farmer to legalize his land, and stipulated as the sale value of the unoccupied government lands much higher price levels than the current ones for land already appropriated. U.S. legislation in the same period had the opposite aim. It was to promote the internal colonization of the country. Covered wagons rolled westward into virgin lands with pioneers who extended the frontier at the cost of slaughtered Indians. The Homestead Act of 1862 assured every family of ownership of a quarter section, a lot 1/2 mile square. Each beneficiary committed himself to farm his parcel for a minimum of 5 years. The public domain was colonized with startling speed. The population grew and spread like a great oil smear. The fertile land that was to be had almost gratis drew European peasants like a magnet. They crossed the ocean and then the Appalachians onto the wide open prairies. Thus, it was free farmers who occupied the new central and western territories. As the country grew in extent and population, unemployment was avoided by the creation of farm jobs. At the same time, an internal market, multitude of farmer proprietors, was generated with substantial purchasing power to sustain industrial development. In contrast, the rural workers who have pushed Brazil's frontier inland for more than a century have not been and are not free peasant families seeking a piece of land of their own, but as Ribeiro Ribeiro notes, braceros contracted to serve latifundistas who have already taken possession of the great open spaces. So that's who it is. The interior desert have never been accessible, except in this way, to the rural population. Workers have hacked their way through the jungle with machetes to open up the country for the benefit of others. Between 1950 and 65 Brazilian latifundios absorbed a quarter of the new land brought under cultivation. These two opposite systems of internal colonization reveal one of the most important differences between U.S. and Latin American development models. Why is the North rich and the South poor? The Rio Grande is much more than a geographical frontier. It is today's profound disequilibrium, which seems to confirm Hegel's prophecy of inevitable war between the two Americas, to be traced to U.S. imperialistic expansion, or does it have more ancient roots? In fact, back to the colonial beginnings, North and South had already generated very different societies with different aims. The Mayflower pilgrims did not cross the sea to obtain legendary treasures. They came mainly to establish themselves with their families and to reproduce in the New World the system of life and work they had practiced in Europe. They were not soldiers of fortune, but pioneers. They came not to conquer, but to colonize, and their colonies were settlements. It is true that a slave plantation economy like Latin America's developed later, south of the Delaware, but there was a difference. The center of gravity in the United States was from the outset the farms and workshops of New England, from which came the victorious armies of the Civil War. New England colonists, the original nucleus of U.S. civilization, never acted as colonial agents for European capitalist accumulation. Their own development and the development of their new land were always their motivation. The 13 colonies served as an outlet for the army of European peasants and artisans who were being thrown off the labor market by metropolitan development. Free workers formed the base of that new society across the ocean. Spain and Portugal, on the other hand, had abundance of subjugated labor in Latin America. Enslavement of the Indians was followed by the wholesale transplantation of Africans. Through the centuries, a legion of unemployed peasants was always available to be moved to production centers. As precious metal or sugar exports rose and fell, flourishing centers coexisted in centers of decay, and the later provided labor for the former. This structure persists to our time. Today, as yesterday, it means low wage scales because of the pressure of the unemployed on the labor market and frustrates the growth of the internal consumer market. But also, in contrast to Northern Puritans, internal economic development was never the goal of the ruling classes of Latin American colonial society. Their profits came from outside. They were tied more to foreign market than to their own domain. Landlords, miners, and merchants had been born to fulfill the mission of supplying Europe with gold, silver, and food. Goods moved along the roads in only one direction, to the port and overseas markets. This also provides the key to the United States expansion as a national unit and to the fragmentation of Latin America. Our production centers are not interconnected but take the form of a fan with a far-away vertex. One might say that the 13 colonies had the fortune of bad fortune. Their history shows the great importance of not being born important. For the north of America had no gold or silver, no Indian civilizations with dense concentrations of people already organized for work, no fabulously fertile tropical soil on the coastal fringe. It was an area with both nature and history had been miserly. Both metals and the slave labor to wrest it from the ground were missing. Those colonists were lucky. Furthermore, the northern colonies from Maryland to New England to Nova Scotia had a climate and soil similar to British agriculture and produced exactly the same things. That is, as Sergio Bagu notes, they did not offer products complementary to the metropolis. The situation in the Antilles and the mainland Spanish-Portuguese colonies was quite different. Tropical lands produced sugar, tobacco, cotton, indigo, turpentine. A small Caribbean island had more economic importance for England than the 13 colonies that would become the United States. These circumstances explain the rise and consolidation of the United States as an economically autonomous system, one which did not drain abroad the wealth it produced. The ties between colony and metropolis were slender. In Barbados and Jamaica, on the other hand, only the capital necessary to replace worn-out slaves was reinvested. Thus, it was not racial factors that decided the development of the one and the underdevelopment of the other. There was nothing Spanish or Portuguese about Britain's Antillean islands. The truth is that the economic insignificance of 13 colonies permitted the early diversification of their exports and set off the early and rapid development of manufacturing. Even before independence, North American industrialization had official encouragement and protection. England took a tolerant attitude while it strictly forbade its Antillean islands to manufacture so much as a pin. On the last night of 1970, 3 of God's bankers met in a hotel in Nassau. Caressed by tropical breezes, surrounded by postcard scenery, Robert Calvi, Michel Sindona, and Paul Marcinkus celebrated the birth of a new year by raising their glasses in a prayer for the annihilation of Marxism. 12 years later, they annihilated the Banco Ambrosiano. The Banco Ambrosiano wasn't Marxist, known as La Banco dei Preti, the priest's bank. Ambrosiano would not accept stockholders who had not been baptized. It wasn't the only banking institution linked to the church. Back in 1605, Pope Paul V had founded the Bank of the Holy Ghost, which no longer performed financial miracles for divine benefit, as it had been taken over by the Italian state, but the Vatican had, and continues to have, its own official bank, piously called the Institute for Religious Works. In any case, Ambrosiano was very important, the second largest private bank in Italy, and the Financial Times called its collapse the greatest crisis in the history of Western banking. In this colossal swindle, over $1 billion went missing, and the Vatican itself, one of the bank's primary stockholders and greatest beneficiaries of its loans, was directly implicated. Many camels went through the eye of the needle. Ambrosiano wove a global spider's web for laundering and money from drug trafficking and arms dealing, working hand in hand with Sicilian and U.S. mafias, with drug networks in Turkey and Colombia. The Cosa Nostra used it to evade taxes on the profits of its smuggling and kidnapping operations, and it sent a shower of dollars to Polish unions fighting against the communist regime. The bank also generously supplied the Contras in Nicaragua and the P2 Lodge in Italy, Masons who allied with their traditional enemy, the Church, to fight the Red Threat. The capos of the P2 received $100 million from Ambrosiano, which contributed to their family prosperity and helped them set up a parallel government for carrying out terrorist attacks meant to punish the Italian left and sow panic among the population. The bank was cleaned out over a number of years, its assets flowing into a number of open financial mouths in Switzerland, Bahamas, Panama, and other fiscal paradises. Heads of government, ministers, cardinals, bankers, captains of industry, and top bureaucrats were all accomplices in the looting organized by Calvi, Sandoa, and Marcinkus. Calvi, who administered monies for the Holy See and presided over Ambrosiano, was famous for his icy smile and his accounting pirouettes. Sindona, king of the Italian Stock Exchange, trusted by the Vatican to handle its investments in real estate and finance, also served as a bagman for the U.S. Embassy's donations to right-wing parties. He owned banks, factories, and hotels in several countries, and was even the owner of the Watergate building in Washington, which earned a spot in the historical books thanks to the curiosity of Richard Nixon. Archbishop Marcinkus, who presided over the Institute of Religious Works, was born in Chicago in the same neighborhood as Al Capone. muscular man always chomping on a cigar. He had been the Pope's bodyguard before he became his business manager. 3 men worked for the greater glory of God in their own pocketbooks. It could be said that they had successful careers, but none of them escaped the persecution and martyrdom trumpeted by the Gospels for apostles of their faith. Shortly before Banco Ambrosiano went belly up, Roberto Calvi was found hanged under a bridge in London. 4 years later, Michel Sardona, then in minimum security prison, asked for coffee with sugar. They didn't quite catch the order and gave him coffee with cyanide. A few months after that, the arrest warrant was issued for Archbishop Marcinkus for fraudulent bankruptcy. 60 years ago, the Argentine writer Roberto Arlt had some advice for anyone wanting to pursue a career in politics. Proclaim, I have robbed. I aspire to robbing on a larger scale. Promise to sell off every last inch of Argentine soil, to sell the Congress building and turn the Palace of Justice into a tenement. In your speeches say, stealing isn't easy, gentlemen. You have to be a cynic, and that's what I am. You have to be a traitor, and that's what I am, end quote. Arlt thought this would be a surefire formula for success, since all the scoundrels speak of is honesty, and people tire of lies. A Brazilian politician, Adhemar de Barros, won over the electorate of the state of Sao Paulo, the richest in the country, with the slogan, Rouba mas faz. He steals, but he gets things done. In Argentina, in contrast, Arlt's advice never caught on, and today it's still impossible to find a politician who has the courage to admit he will steal or to confess he has stolen. And none of these looters of the public purse is capable of acknowledging, quote, I stole for myself. I stole to give myself the good life, end quote. If any of them had a conscience that could torment him, he would at least say, quote, I did it for the party, for the people, for the country, quote. Some politicians love their country so much they take it all home. Roberto Arlt's formula won't work. No Brazilian politician has copied Adhemar de Barros' recipe. As a general rule, what garners the most votes are the arts of theater, good acting, well-chosen masks, as another Argentine writer, Jose Pablo Feynman, once put it. Electoral politics tend to reward doublespeak and split personalities. Many professional politicians cultivate schizophrenia that turns timid Clark Kent into Superman just by removing his glasses, and insipid Bruce Wayne into Batman when he puts on his Batcape. You don't need to be a poli-sci major to realize that political speeches usually have to be read backwards for the real meaning. There are a few exceptions to the rule. Politicians promise change, and once they're elected, they change their minds. Sometimes they turn around so fast they get dizzy and you get a stiff neck from watching them spin to the right. Quote, education and health first, end quote. They proclaim like the captain of a ship crying, quote, women and children first, end quote. And sure enough, education and health are the first to drown. Their words praise hard work and their deeds damn workers. Politicians who swear hand over heart that national sovereignty has no price tend to be the ones who give it away for nothing. And those who proclaim they'll round up the crooks tend to be the ones who steal even the shoes off horses galloping by. And that's it. And then that's it right now. And I wanted to also read some from Voices of Time, but you already heard me. If you saw the other thing about Eduardo Galeano, proclaim that this is my favorite. So Voices of Time actually my favorite. Amazing. Buy those 3 books, at least, and more.